Direct is good.
Great. So we have a good sized group, so I'm not going to go around the room to introduce ourselves. But if everybody could put their name and affiliation in the chat, that would be fantastic. And we'll take attendance that way. Give people a few more moments to come in. And I'll have the presenters introduce themselves as they come on. So my name is, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Carrie Snyder. I'm the Advocacy Director with the Neponset River Watershed Association. Andrew, why don't you go to the next slide? So as a reminder, this is our fabulous project team with all of you as partners. Thank you so much. You have provided some great information so far, and I know there's still some meetings to go and still some work to be done to wrap this up by the end of June. But we really appreciate all of your participation. Next slide, please. And again, this is just an illustration of this project. There's a lot of moving parts, and I have to switch gears for each part. But we're going to be going over the watershed-wide model portion today. Next slide. And again, just a reminder of the project goals. We're really excited to get everybody working together. We're really excited to see the final model to see where the water is flowing watershed wide. And again, just really appreciate all of the effort that you all have been putting in and responding to surveys and participating in meetings. And I really think we're going to have a great product to show at the end of this project. And now I'm going to turn it over to Andy.
So actually, Carrie, I'm going to jump in.
Sorry,
so hi,
Jenny.
everyone. No problem. So I'm Jenny Moonen from Weston and Sampson, and just wanted to remind folks about our last meeting that was many months ago. As you recall, we provided an update on the model development at that point. We talked about the data gaps and the field work to fill those data gaps. Folks helped provide input and ideas through surveys and all the data responses that you gave us. We reviewed the reported flood issues in the watershed, which have been, as Andy will talk about later, incorporated into the calibration and validation of the model. We went over the future climate scenarios, which I'm going to remind folks of, and we began the discussion about flood mitigation strategies, which everyone weighed in sort of during the meeting with surveys. There was a follow-up survey, and we're going to have more discussion today on those strategies. So based on our discussion at the meeting and that survey, we're running the modeling for 3 planning horizons: present day, 2050, one type of storm event, and 2070. And we are looking at 24-hour design storms, 48-hour design storm, and historic storms that are part of calibration and validation. So if you recall these slides from the first meeting, we just highlighted, these are the storms that we are running the models for. So 2-year, 10-year, and 100-year, as well as for present day and 2070, as well as we're also running the 2050 10-year. We're also looking at longer duration storms, the 48-hour, and we're running just the 10-year, present day, and 2070.
Jenny, real quick, I have the little screens of presenters. I have that on the right side of my screen. Is that getting in the way of the presentation, or can you not see that?
Nope, we can't see that.
Okay,
we're just
great.
seeing the slide, the main slide. So there's no problem
Excellent.
on our end. Yeah. So those are the storms and the events. We also wanted to make sure we did respond to the questions we received in the survey. So there was great input, and we again appreciate all you concurring or asking some detailed questions, but there were 3 we wanted to respond to. So the first one was, after the study is complete, what are some expected outcomes regarding changes or modifications to the model? And I think, Ian, you were going to jump in and help answer this. Neponset has been the spokesperson here.
Yeah, and And it's a little not 100% clear to me exactly what this question was trying to get at, but I think the answer is we are right now working on putting together a plan for a new MVP proposal, which would include a couple of tasks to sort of build on what we've done so far. One would be simply having a little bit more time to fine tune the model and kind of really get it dialed in. And then another would be to try to have some resources to follow up in a little bit more site-specific detail on some of the possible green infrastructure solutions that we identify in the communities. And there would be some other components to that as well. So you should actually be seeing something from us within a week or two, explaining what we're thinking, asking if you guys want to participate, which hopefully you will want to continue participating. And if folks, we've had conversations with a lot of people. I'm not sure we've hit everybody, but if there are particular things or questions you want to see this next round of effort get at, definitely let us know, because we're all ears in terms of making this as useful as possible for all the communities. And then the other thing to know is that if we don't get that grant or whatever, and the model that we've done, all the data that's been pulled together to put into it is in effect in the public domain. So if there's a community that wants to kind of take it a next step on their own, or what have you, all that data and the model itself is available to you or your consultants if you want to kind of do more detailed work on your own. So.
And Ian, you can help me with the second question, which was, many of us will retire by the time the planning thresholds are met. Is this something being considered in the process in the future? And I mean, I think from our perspective, we look at this as a shared responsibility between watershed associations, having continuity of leadership, making this sort of a core component of the organization moving forward, consultants being able to support folks, and communities making resilience a priority. I don't know if.
Yes, I mean, this is anytime you do something with the 50-year horizon, that's always a problem. And part of the support letter for the next round of the grant will be all the current staff who are involved in this project from the towns agreeing not to retire for 50 years. So problem solved. It is definitely, we're planting seeds that are going to be, aspects of which are going to be implemented by our successors. No doubt about it. So.
And the last question was a technical question. Just Andy, if you can go to the next two slides. Why is dam removal not shown on the results? So if you scroll ahead, so this is the green row at the bottom. One of the things that was considered in Charles River work in phase 2 was removing particular municipally owned recreational dams. And then the next slide showed the results of all the nature-based solutions. So this was the nature-based work. And Andy, I think you were going to comment a little on,
Yeah, I was a technical leader on the Charles River watershed modeling effort. And I think during the phase 2 of that project, which occurred last year, I think the dam removals can be highly political, at times contentious, and so I think they had a number of potential dam removals sort of at different phases of investigation and interest, and so they were just working with individual communities rather than maybe looking at it watershed wide. And I know that under phase 3, which is ongoing this year, we are looking at the benefits of 2 different dam removals in that watershed. So it's work that's continuing. It just was sort of taken outside the watershed wide analysis for that one. It just made sense for that watershed.
Thanks. All right. Well, with that, let's move on.
Oh, that's me. I'm Andy Walker. I'm the technical leader at Weston Sampson. I'm the technical leader of the modeling work on this project as well. And I'm going to hopefully not drone on, but speak for about half an hour on the model development process, model calibration, and introduce some of the great results. And then the viewer, web-based viewer that we've put all of the model results into. so that you folks can see all the data and zoom into your towns or your neighborhoods or any area of interest.
And we've left room for questions at the very end, but please interrupt if you have a burning question on the slide for Andy with a raise a hand or unmute yourself. Thanks.
Absolutely. And Jenny, don't if I miss a hand raise or something in the chat, by all means interrupt. I think in the last public presentation, we did go into a little bit of detail about how the model was being developed and what the model would look like. So I won't necessarily, I won't spend too much time talking about the nitty gritty, but just to give you a sense of the scale of the model, you can see on the right-hand side, pink outline is the watershed that was modeled. The thicker dark blue lines are open channels. So it's the main stem of the Neponset, and more than a dozen tributaries were modeled. And then the smaller, thinner, lighter blue lines are all of the stormwater collection systems, storm drains that were incorporated into the model as well. And there's a number of large ponds. You can kind of tell which ones they are. There's a number of large ponds that were incorporated also. But in total, we've modeled more than 117 square miles of watershed. There's 157,000 linear feet of the Neponset River, and more than 3 times that amount in various tributaries. So almost 600,000 linear feet of tributaries. There's 811,000 linear feet of storm drains and culverts incorporated into the model. There are 50 dams. These are jurisdictional dams. So there are also a number of other smaller dams that we sort of ran into in the field, or we identified from aerial imagery that we wanted to include. So it's 50 jurisdictional dams, but there's a couple others in there as well. And nearly 400 culverts or bridges or other road crossings. And the last one there, the 37.4 square miles of floodable area, that makes more sense when you look at this image. So 117 square mile watershed, and more than 37 square miles of it was represented in a 2D mesh. So the model is comprised of one-dimensional components and two-dimensional components. And the one-dimensional components consist of the various subbasins where rainfall is converted into runoff. And it consists of open channel flow, open channel conduits, and closed conduits like culverts or storm drains. And all those conduits work together to move water downstream. But then on top of that is overlaid a 2D mesh, which does 2 things. The 2D mesh, 3 things really. The first thing a 2D mesh does is provide significant amount of flood storage in the channels and in the floodplains and other flood-prone areas. And it also provides a means for when runoff is generated from overwhelmed storm drains or from a river or tributary jumping its banks, it provides a means for the water to move downstream. So 2D mesh is for all that great storage, and it's for moving water from upstream to downstream. And the third thing it's for is output. So each one of those nearly 30,000 grid cells, each one of them can become wet and show inundation. And we'll see that. That is what the model output is that you'll see in the viewers, those little 2D cells lighting up various shades of blue to give you a sense for how much it floods. And where does all that information come from? I won't dive into the details terribly, but all kinds of different sources. So the first place we went were publicly available GIS, things like LIDAR and the USGS's stream center lines, aerial imagery, land cover databases, soils, name it. And we supplemented that with publicly available studies, things like FEMA flood insurance studies and dam inspection reports. And then you communities provided tremendous amount of stormwater GIS, which we incorporated into the model. And then we brought all that into a sort of a draft model and identified where the data gaps were. Where are the areas of the system that we feel we need more information to adequately and accurately model it. And so we performed about a week's worth of field investigations to fill those data gaps. And then the 2D coverage, the two-dimensional parts of the model come from the outlines of them were first identified based on the FEMA 500-year flood extents, right? So, okay, there's going to be a lot of flooding in those areas, so we want to make sure those are part of the 2D mesh because there's going to be a good amount of storage there, and we want to be able to provide output in those locations. So that was a starting point. And then other areas where we felt there was additional flooding that maybe wasn't part of the FEMA National Flood Hazard Layer or Q3 database, we supplemented that and added additional 2D coverage. And then we assigned elevation data to that 2D mesh using the latest LiDAR. That's a very kind of quick overview of what the model looks like and how it was developed. But the important thing is that, one of the most important things is you build this highly complex model. You want to make sure that it's able to reproduce historical flood events and that you can trust the output coming out of it. We did that through a model calibration and verification process. To calibrate the model, which consists of we tweak individual model input parameters sort of iteratively. We make a change and then we run the model. We see how it matches up against historically observed conditions, and based on how it responds, we tweak another input parameter. That's a very iterative process. And the historical event we focused on for that was the March 2010 event, one of, if not the largest events that this watershed's experienced in the last 100 years. It was 9.41 inches over about 60 hours, albeit with a relatively low peak intensity of 0.3 inches per hour. And what we used to derive the calibration simulations was rainfall data from the Blue Hills gauge, the National Weather Service gauge, which offers very high quality data consistently, no gaps during this storm. There's another data set at the Norwood Airport, but we found some periods where no data was collected. And so we opted to go with the Blue Hills gauge, which is, rather than being right in the middle of the watershed, is maybe a little bit closer to the edge of it. You'll see that on a map in a minute. But the data appeared to match the Norwood Airport well, but there was no gaps. So we went with Blue Hills. And then there's 4 USGS gauges in the watershed. Which is fantastic, which offers real live sort of recorded streamflow data against which to calibrate the model. So we put rainfall into the model from the Blue Hills gauge. We simulate the model, we see what happens downstream, and then we compare the streamflow that the model is predicting against the USGS gauge data. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But not only that, we had tremendous resource of feedback from communities and the citizens about where they have experienced flooding during the March 2010 event or others. So we have this sort of identification of flood-prone areas across the watershed, from top to bottom, all over the watershed. And so not only are we able to calibrate the model to reproduce stream flow that the USGS has recorded, but we're also able to tweak the 2D mesh to make sure that it's representing sort of the land surface conditions adequately, so that we're reproducing where flooding has historically happened. So we sort of calibrated the model in those two unique ways. And then we calibrated the model, we made a bunch of changes to it. We wanted to make sure that the changes we made also made sense in other types of storm events. And so we ran a verification run. And for that, we used Hurricane Ida, a more recent, more intense rainfall event. It's about 4.09 inches over 18 hours with a peak intensity of almost 1 inch per hour. So it's a different kind of storm. Okay, so this is really sort of a visual of some of the things I was talking about a moment ago. You can see the 4. Can you guys see my cursor? Yes, okay, great. So I'm just going to move my talking head over to the other side. So you can see the sort of the 1D framework in the model. These are the open channel areas. And then there's 4 USGS gauges. Milton at the bottom, purple triangle here, and this is its immediate drainage area. Green Lodge, also on the Neponset main stem in the middle of the watershed. And then there's sort of two headwater areas. The Norwood gauge captures streamflow data coming out of the sort of the western headwaters area. And then there's the east branch of the Neponset River here, which is gauged by another USGS gauge in Canton in pink. And then here's the location of the Blue Hill rain gauge, right at the edge of the watershed. And there is one in Norwood, like I said, more centrally located, but they have very similar rainfall data. It's just the Blue Hills gauge was more consistent. So this is an example of the type of calibration results that we've been looking at. In the top half of the graphic, you see the rainfall over time during the March 2010 calibration event. Not too intense, peak intensity of about 0.3 inches. You've got more than 9 inches over a period of 2.5 days. And then down here is a simulated versus observed stream flow. This particular graph represents the East Branch headwaters area in Canton. And so the light blue line is what was observed, what was measured by the USGS gauge. And then the green line is what was simulated at that same location. And we really like this plot. There's a lot that matches really well, right? The first 2 days of the storm, it's got really great agreement. The rising limb, we call this, as the stream flow is sort of picking up, really strong match. And then it does deviate a little bit. At the peak of the storm, we do see higher peak intensities in the model than was observed at the USGS gauge. And that honestly is pretty typical for a watershed model of this size. It's difficult to model the incredible detail needed to match that peak perfectly without sort of melting your computer or having run times in the model be so long that they can't be completed in a reasonable amount of time. So it's a little bit of a balancing act, but this is very typical for watershed models of this size. Tend to overestimate the peak intensity a little bit, and then the total runoff volume is often a little bit low. What does that mean for model accuracy? Depending where you are in the watershed, the intensity of flooding impacts can be a function of peak stream flow or total runoff volume. If you've got a steep stream, flooding impacts are going to tend to be driven by peak runoff. If you have a very sluggish stream, a backwater situation, a large wetland, it's going to tend to be a function of total runoff volume. And I think sort of big picture, we see more impacts in this watershed that are driven by runoff volume. And so we try to thread the needle a little closer to matching the runoff volume than the peak. So the total runoff was matched, to within 6%, and peak flow rate a little bit more than 30. But like I said, we're really happy with the shape of this curve. I think that it's a very strong match. We saw a very similar situation at the Norwood gauge and the other headwaters. Again, incredible match in the first 2 days, really nice rising limb. Slightly overestimating the peak runoff, but the volume has got a really nice match. So, total runoff volume within 8%, and the peak flow rate 20% higher than observed, but still a nice match. The other way we calibrated against historical, sort of anecdotally observed flood-prone areas from community feedback and public feedback. You can see all of those locations are marked out in purple triangles over here. They're in red triangles on these smaller images. And you're starting to see the model results, right? So this is what the model says floods during the calibration event, the March 2010 event. And we'll zoom in here. So the Manor neighborhood in Dedham, right? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 locations. All of them are either in a flooded cell or 1 cell away. So we've got really good agreement. Locations where flooding was reported in the Manor neighborhood, the model is sort of picking those up and showing flooding right there or very close. So very happy with that. Another example, University Ave in Norwood. Again, we've got 3 locations. So this one right in the thick of simulated flooding. This one right at the edge of it, so very close. And this one is a little bit further off. And I'll speak a little bit more to this in a slide or two, but the reason for that is that the pipe, its flooding is most likely a result of a storm drain that couldn't keep up with the runoff arriving in the storm drain. That storm drain is smaller than 18 inches, so it wasn't incorporated directly into the model. So again, I'll speak to some of the limitations of the model in a minute, but again, really happy with the match. Areas that have been shown to flood in the past that are in close proximity to large storm drains or open channels, we're seeing that they're flooded in the model output. We ran a verification simulation. Again, seen decent match here. Total runoff volume within 5%. Peak flow rates a little high. The shape of the rising limb is very similar to observed as well, although it starts a little higher. Overview of the sort of big picture. We found a good match against historical streamflow volume, so the total volume arriving at the 4 calibration locations, really strong match within 10%. A fair match against historical peak flows, right? Our peak flows are a little high, but a fair match. And then also a good match regarding flood-prone locations and flooding extents based on feedback from the communities and their citizens. So really happy overall with how the model has calibrated out. And we think it'll be a really strong tool to look at flooding impacts sort of under no action scenarios for baseline climates and future climates alike. I do want to just speak very quickly to some of the limitations, so there's no sort of misconceptions. The model is a really powerful tool for looking at flooding. But like I alluded to, here's an example. Norwood Center, generally drained by storm drains that are less than 18 inches. And so it just wasn't feasible, either timeline or budget to include every single storm drain in every community in the watershed. And so the cutoff was 18-inch pipes. And this area, it just happens to be served by a lot of 8, 12, 15-inch pipes. And so it doesn't show it doesn't show flooding in these areas where it's been historically observed. And that's due to the fact that it just doesn't have those pipes in the model. It could also be that these areas have inlet capacity issues. Sometimes, right, catch basins might be perched up due to settling, and so the water has to pond a couple of inches before it even reaches a catch basin. That's not incorporated in the model. Sometimes runoff is too intense for a single catch basin. Sometimes there needs to be 2 catch basins to handle all that runoff, or a double catch basin. We didn't model individual catch basins in this model. There's so many, it would not be feasible. So if there's inlet capacity issues that's causing flooding, this model won't capture that necessarily. Certainly not as it is now. Maintenance issues, insufficient maintenance or debris buildup of beaver dams, or temporary conditions that cause flooding. Those types of situations aren't going to show up in the model results. And of course, we added dozens of miles of open channel, dozens of miles of tributaries, dozens of ponds, but we're not able to capture every last one. There are small tributaries or small ponds that just weren't included directly into the model. They're sort of part of the subcatchments. And so flooding around the perimeter of those won't necessarily show up. Groundwater too, sometimes we see flooding because you get groundwater breakout, or the groundwater is very shallow. And that doesn't necessarily show up in this model as well. This is a surface water model. So a few limitations, but just to be clear, this model it's well calibrated. And it does, I think, as a calibration and verification results show, it does a good job of showing what areas would be expected to flood under a number of theoretical scenarios or design starts. And so we move forward. Actually, maybe that's on. I pause here quickly. Are there any questions, Jenny? Anything in the chat about model
There's
development?
nothing in the chat for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Silence.
All right.
All right.
Let's get to the good stuff. Using this model, we evaluated all the design terms that Jenny sort of summarized at the beginning. All right, and so here are some results. Oh, it's just somebody entering. Here are the results. So let me orient you. Blue is a 2-year event. Orange is a 10-year. And gray is 100. On the left, these are baseline climate scenarios. So we have baseline 2-year, baseline 10-year, baseline 100-year. In the middle is the single 2050 event we ran, which was a 10-year recurrence interval. And then on the right, these are the 2070 climate scenario runs. So 2072, 2070-10, and 2070-100. These are all 24-hour events. And we are looking at total runoff generated in the watershed. So lots of different ways of looking at output. This is maybe one of the highest level ways of looking. And so what's interesting to compare here is blue under a baseline climate versus blue under a 2070 climate scenario. So we're looking at a 40% increase in total runoff generated in the watershed during the 2-year or the bankful event. You can make a similar comparison for the 10-year. So it jumps from about 6,500 acre feet to more than 13,000. It is expected to double total runoff volume. And then the 100-year, sort of a similarly large increase. So it's about an 80% increase for total runoff volume generated in the watershed when going from a baseline 100-year to a 2070 100-year. Let's look at some numbers that are maybe a little less terrifying. This is, I can't see it because it's covered on my screen, but you guys can see that the output here, we're looking at inundated area. And we're talking in terms of square miles. So same setup, baseline on the left, 2050 in the middle, 2070 on the right. And so you can see the 2-year, 2-year of today is 11.19 square miles are inundated in the model. And that increases, that's expected to increase to 11.95 square miles under a 2070 climate scenario. So it's, just shy of a 7% increase. As with total runoff volume, we see the greatest increase associated with the 10-year events. So going from the baseline 10-year, 12.25 square miles of flooded area, we're going to 14.32, so just shy of a 17% increase. And then we see about just shy of a 9% increase for the 100-year recurrence interval. Now, it's important to note that that flooded area is not all downtowns and main streets. A good portion of that increase in flooded area occurs in wetlands or near stream or undeveloped areas. And so there aren't necessarily impacts to humans or human infrastructure. And we can see that in, we'll see that in another slide. You'll see, we'll start to start to zoom in on certain areas of the watershed, and you can see what those increases really mean as far as impacts to our communities. But before I go on, it was also important to many communities to look at longer duration events. Some communities also wanted to look at back-to-back events, which in many ways are similar to longer events. It's not always exactly the same, but those two types of situations, longer events or back-to-back events, they tend to be a bit similar. So a different kind of stress test for a watershed. So we did run 2 48-hour events, one for a baseline 10-year and one for a 2070 10-year. So again, you can see that the runoff volumes increase by nearly 70%. but that the flooding extent is closer to 12% increase. Now you start to see like the real power of the model. This is the Dedham Manor neighborhood. This is a side-by-side, so we're looking at the same area for two different events. But the Manor neighborhood is over here. The Neponset River runs through here, and there's a MBTA commuter rail embankment. And on this side is a large wetland complex that a lot of storm drains from the Manor neighborhood discharge into. So what you see here on the left is the baseline 10-year event. So we see plenty of water in that wetland. We see some, and let me also say that the darker the shade of blue, the deeper the water, which is why you see the darkest cells closest to the river, because the river is X feet deep, so you see deeper flooding there. And as the floodplain gets shallower, the depth of flooding decreases. But baseline, climate, 10-year, this is the model output in this area. And then you go over to the same area, but the 2070 10-year, you see two things. The first is that the flooding extents have increased. This whole area is now expected to flood. Well, there are a couple of pockets of dry land, but a lot more flooding extents over here. But you also see increased depths of flooding. So the wetland over by the Manor neighborhood on the western side of the embankment, the flooding extents do increase a little bit, but mostly we're seeing increased depths of flooding, which can create issues as well. So it's kind of a more zoomed in way of looking at the model output. Two different ways you can view it. You can view it in terms of, you can see where flooding extents will increase and also where flooding depths will increase. Here's one more example down near the Norwood Airport. Again, we're looking at the baseline versus the 2070 climate scenarios, but this is for the 100-year event. So a much bigger event. Baseline on the left, see quite a lot of flooding in the wetlands around the airport, as well as over here. And if you look at the right, the 2070, you don't see a tremendous increase in inundation extents, but you do see some notable increases in flooding depth, particularly near the airport. You see these darker blue cells. Now, all this information, all the model outputs are available to you. There's a link here. You'll be asked for a login, just here. Oops. A login here and the password. And I think, Jenny, were you going to put that in the chat?
Yep. So I've been putting that in the chat so folks can do it on their own computer.
Great. And let me share a different screen and I'll show you. There we go. And let me share my screen. Is everybody seeing the viewer on my screen? Excellent. Let me show you around. So the first thing you can take a look at over here, you can zoom into your address or your town, sort of quickly zoom into your area of interest. You can change the base map. Lots of different base maps to choose from. I'll leave this one on for now. You can, I believe you can bookmark. You can go to your location if you're on a tablet or a phone. And there's a slider here. I'll get back to that in a minute, but basically it allows you to compare two sets of model results at once. And then over here in the top right, there's lots of different layers to choose from. So I'm gonna move everybody's faces here. There's a legend. The first button is a legend, so all the layers that are active. The second button, base layers. Those are, although I turned all these on to start with, but you can, right? So there's nothing. There's a watershed boundary. Here's all the communities within the watershed and their boundaries. And then sort of the major streams and ponds. Leave those Actually, I'm going to turn off streams and ponds for a minute. And then the second button is some watershed attributes or sort of model components. So we've got dams in the watershed. These are the 50 jurisdictional dams. You can click on them. You can click on each one of them. It gives you publicly available information about each one of them. And that's true for all layers. You should be able to click on all layers to get information about what it is. Model subcatchments. These are the more than 4,000 subcatchments we modeled in your watershed. Model junctions. These are all so we use junctions to connect two conduits every time there's a change in pipe size or an intersection or a change in the shape of a channel. We've got 1D conduits, model junctions. And then here are the conduits. Red are open channel. So these are all the open channels, all the streams and all the rivers that we've modeled. And the green is all the storm drains of culverts that we've modeled. And then the next button here has got a couple of choices. Flooding, which is the results. I'll get to that last. Flooded areas. These are sort of all the anecdotal reports of flooding in the watershed from different surveys, all the great feedback. They can see all those. Digitized for posterity. We've got FEMA layers here, so FEMA National Flood Hazard Layer, as well as the Q5 data as well. I'm sorry, Q3 data as well. For this particular watershed, it's really just Canton that's still in Q3. It hasn't been included in the FEMA National Flood Hazard Layer just yet. So both layers are in there. And a quick word on sea level rise. This is the these are all the sea level rise projections commissioned by the state of Massachusetts. These model results do include some riverine inputs from the major rivers in the state, including the Neponset. So that these results, the sea level rise sub tab here, these represent sort of anticipated tidal extents with some riverine inputs. Our model results are we assumed a mean sea level. So rather than showing inundation down here in the tidally controlled portion of the Neponset, what it would look like at a high tide, combined with massive flooding coming down the river from the watershed, we used a mean sea level. We sort of paired that with flooding coming down the watershed. So we're trying a little bit of a balancing act here, right? So the dynamic sea level layers have lots of sea level modeling with some riverine inputs, and we're doing the reverse route. Lots of sort of riverine results paired with some tidal. And then last but not least, this is the results of all our hard work. I will say the calibration events, these results are still draft. The other ones are final. I apologize. They all say draft, but all the results here are final except for calibration event. And in the next day or two, we'll be updating this to the final version as well. A calibration and the validation event. So that's the March 2010 and the Hurricane Ida, September 2021. So those two are still drafts. Their final versions will be added by Monday. But the remaining simulation results are all final. And let's look at some. Let's look at the baseline 10-year. So here's the baseline 10-year. So you can, of course, you can zoom way out. And just a warning, if you, like I just did, sometimes, you know, if you move on before it fully loads the model results, sometimes it won't finish loading the results in your new location, and it'll look like there's no flooding It's usually pretty obvious because one half of your screen will have flooding results and the other will be blank. So it's usually pretty obvious, but it's messed us up more than once. So if you're panning around the watershed, sometimes you just need to wait just for a half second. But you can zoom in to an area of particular interest, right? Right, Mother Brook and the Ponset area. And we can do this. But I've turned those on and I want to compare it. Oops. I'm going to turn on my 2070 10-year results. So I've turned them both on, and here we go. So I can use this slider, and on the left side are the baseline 10-year, and on the right side, the swipe layer is the 2070. So you can slide it back and forth and see areas that are expected to worsen. Move on to another area, we can do the same thing. Right, so you can see much darker blues, right? Here's a good example. This is the Manor neighborhood area we were looking at before. Lighter blues, shallower flooding, a lot more polygon, a lot more hexagons are lit up blue, so greater flooding extents, but also darker blues. We can do something similar for a baseline 100 and the 2070 100. Sometimes when you select a new file, a new layer here, it will zoom you out all the way. Again.
So are folks following along and trying this on their own computers, or anyone have any questions for Andy while we're all here? Okay. Well, there's going to be a chance for a follow-up survey. So if you have questions on this or about how to use it or what you're seeing, you can follow up with us. Great.
Right. And I want to go back to the presentation.
Yeah, that'd be great, Andy. Yeah, so we're going to move on to talk about, Andy's gone through all of the model calibration, validation, what's predicted to happen in the future, but we're also thinking about what are the solutions to this flooding. And we think about it in sort of two scales. We're looking at it on what we call like a watershed basis. And there's a number. Oh, I have a question in here. Jason has asked, is the model final or are there still a few tweaks left?
The model is final.
Yeah, there was a terminology issue, Jason, with the viewer. We will adjust that very quickly here.
One question, Andy. Just so this is not set up as public just yet, because you do need to log in with those ArcGIS credentials that you mentioned. Do people need to be aware that at this point, I mean, in theory, that account could like delete things if people were really messing around? Is that true? So people just need to be a little cognizant of what they're doing when they're logged in that way.
I'm going to regret saying this, but I don't think that you can move layers or delete layers or change them.
That's a good thing. Just
please don't try to destroy it, but I think we're safe.
So I see a question from Hannah in the chat. Jason, give us a sec. How does the model calibration validation outcome compare with the Charles River watershed modeling effort?
Quite similar. We found very similar. Just like the Neponset, it's common with all large watersheds. We try to thread the needle. You try to balance recreating peak flows with total runoff volumes, so you get sort of the best results possible across the watershed. But we were looking at rather similar percentages. In fact, in some ways, the total times.
Hey, Andy, sorry, when you turn your mic, because you're on the headset, gets a little quiet.
Yep, sorry, thank you. Yeah, they compare, the long story short is they compare similarly with similar percentages.
Okay, Jason, you're up next.
Thanks, Jenny. Excuse me. So we'll be able to host this viewer locally on our own map gallery? Is that possible, or is this something that will not be able to be, individualized for each community, or is it something that we all have to go to this one to be able to realize the resource?
Good question.
Jerice, what are your thoughts about that? Maybe that's a good question if you're still on.
I will say for the Charles, I think Weston and Sampson hosted it on their server through the end of the project. And then I think like the first week in July, we sort of did a handoff with CRWA and they sort of set it up on their own servers.
And the model output layers, Jason, are available to everyone. So
Absolutely. And those can be, the model outputs can be provided in a GIS compatible format. So even if a particular community is not able to or not interested in recreating the entire viewer, the model output will certainly be provided in a format they can use.
All right, yeah. And sorry, this question is kind of out of topic here, but is it possible to, with that data, work with any town's GIS managers to be able to develop such a viewer locally with that data if, it can't be shared, so to speak, from where you guys have it stored now to like the town's account or whatever it may be? Is there a way for you to work with us as part of this so we can locally host it on our own so residents can see it, our staff can use it whenever need be for whatever purposes that we generate out of this whole study?
yeah, Jason, I don't see why that would be a problem. So we can follow up with you.
Okay, thank you.
Others that are interested. Yeah, we'll be working with Neponset on the ultimate hosting of this after the project. So great. And there was a question in the chat about going over the slider again and just explaining how the comparison works. And we do need to, I mean, we're okay on time right now, but
Reshare the viewer. Are you guys looking at the viewer now?
Yep.
So you can select any number of outputs over here. So I've only been choosing 2, but you could choose 3 10-year events. So I've turned on the baseline 2050 and 2070-year events. And then if you want to swipe, you click this button. You can only swipe 1 layer at a time. So it doesn't necessarily make sense if you've got lots of layers on, but if I want to swipe the 2070, so it basically, on one side of the screen, the 2070 is on, and on the other, it's off. But you don't see much of a difference here because the 2050 is also on. But if I turn the 2050 off, now there's just 2 layers are showing, and on one side of the screen, the 2070 is on, and on the other side, it's off. So the left side of my screen, the 2070 results are turned off, and on the right side, they're turned on. And you can just move the slider back and forth to your heart's content.
and we can show this again at the 3rd model meeting when we have the results so you can see the differences. So I think with that, let's move on because we should keep going so we have enough time for the group discussions about solutions. All right, so I was getting started in saying we're thinking of this as watershed-wide solutions and sort of individual site solutions. So if everyone recalls, at the first flood meeting, we started to introduce the watershed-wide solutions. We had some live polls, and then we had a survey after the meeting. And we were sort of starting with what the Charles River did, but thinking about it specifically for, Neponset and what folks were interested in. So we had found in the Charles that, the green stormwater infrastructure component was a valued flood reduction solution, and decided to do an aggressive approach here. So it's sort of 2 alternatives put together. The first one is storing the 2-year 2070 storm event, so 4.5 inches from half of the impervious area in the entire watershed, added with looking at all existing developed parcels. So that's public and private, but not roads that contain 1 or more acres of impervious. And this is including sort of separate parcels under common ownership. And that's sort of to align with the potential residual designation authority thought process. But we're looking at an aggressive option, which is where they may be retrofitted or when they're redeveloped, adjusted to meet what Cambridge requires, which is to store the 4.2 inches, which is the difference between the 2070 25-year storm and the 2-year storm. So then we have 3 other alternatives. The second one is we had heard from folks that floodplain restoration, reconnection, and wetland restoration was a priority. That was in the survey of at last flood model meeting. So we're looking at what if you theoretically expanded the area around wetlands and stream channels. So for wetlands, we're looking at what if they got bigger by 20%, and that's each wetland. So it's not a linear sort of scale. It's take the surface area and make it 20% bigger. So bigger wetlands get a lot bigger. And then also looking at restoring and preserving stream channels within the 100-foot buffer around streams. We are looking at man-made situations, also looking at upland pond storage. This includes increasing the elevation of overflows, the volume of storage, or changing operations for impoundments. So we're planning to model 3 to 5 feet of additional functional storage. Targeted dams, we're going to exclude 4 that were indicated by Neponset as being that we should exclude. And the last option is looking at land conservation. It's really about undeveloped, unprotected land in the watershed that could be developed. So we want to do a comparison approach here and assume, okay, what if you developed this land, if this land was developed and it was designed basically so that pre and post development runoff rates were using NOAA Atlas 14, which not every community is using, but many are. We think this sort of approximates existing conditions, current requirements, and then compare it to one of 2 options. And we are going to look for some input from folks here with a show of hands. The first option is to assume, what if the Mass DEP policy was enacted where it requires NOAA Atlas 14 plus? And that's storing approximately 1.82 inches. And Andy's going to jump in and talk a little bit more about the graph and the differences. And the second option is, what if we're way more aggressive and thinking, what if we do something like the Cambridge policy, store the 4.2 inches?
Yeah, just a couple sentences on what option 1 is.
So Andy, can you move your,
What?
keep talking.
Okay. Just a couple sentences on what option 1 is. So, usually when people say they use NOAA Atlas 14, and what our baseline simulations are based on, is using the average value that NOAA came up with. So that you've got precipitation depth on the left, on the y-axis, and then the size of the storm, the recurrence interval on the x-axis. So normally we would go, hey, I want to model a 25-year. So you go to the 25-year recurrence interval, you come up to the black line, which is the average value that NOAA predicts. However, some communities and some agencies are to be more aggressive or to sort of increase resilience faster are using the upper bound. So NOAA recognizes that their estimate of these sort of design rainfall depths, there's some uncertainty there. And so the green and red represent the 90% confidence interval. So there's a 90% chance the true value falls somewhere between the green and the red line. And so some communities or agencies are opting to use the upper bound value as opposed to the average value in NOAA 14. And so just as an example, near the middle of the Neponset River watershed, that the difference between the black line and the green line for the 25-year storm is about 1.82 inches. So what Jenny's referring to is we would compare the NOAA Atlas 14 values to a version where there's an additional 1.82 inches of storage. Or option 2 is we'll compare it to the Cambridge policy that they're using there, which is even more aggressive, which is to store an additional 4.2 inches. So more than double the additional storage. So
what we're trying to get at here is, which scenarios would you like us to run? Do you want to see what it would do if Mass DEP, we kind of go with what Mass DEP's proposing, or do you want to look at like a way more aggressive scenario? So I think can we do a show of hands on here? Sorry, I'm a little Zoom unsavvy, Ian.
I think people can use the reactions
Okay.
button to give a thumbs up or raise a hand.
Or people could put in the chat.
Or yeah, or people could comment in the chat either way.
Let's do that. If you would like option 1 or option 2, can you respond in the chat? And if you have questions, please unmute yourself. And feel free to jump. Okay. So far we're tied. So far option 2 is looking stronger.
And Jenny, do we want to go on and sort of show some of the results from the scenario 1A, 1B we did? And
Yeah,
while
let's
people
let
are- while
folks
votes are coming in?
folks weigh in the chat, and we can come back to this at the very end. We'll have to look at the numbers. Yeah, there'll be, like I said, there's a follow-up survey from this meeting. You can reflect, think about it. We will give you a chance to weigh in on this again. So
Yeah, you might even change your vote to see.
Yep.
These results.
okay.
Okay, so this is, we built the model, we calibrated the model, we ran all the baseline events and the future climate scenario events, and now we're starting to model the sort of watershed-wide mitigation scenarios. As Jenny mentioned, scenario 1 consists of 2 components, both were related to additional green stormwater infrastructure, right? There's increasing storage from all impervious surfaces, and then additional storage for parcels with a large amount of impervious surface, basically. These two graphs, blue is, so there's 2 graphs. On the left is runoff volumes, which you'll remember shows higher, scarier percentages, and then on the right is flooded extents. So it's the actual increase in flooding extent. And blue is no action, or existing conditions, no action. Orange is our model results for if you implement scenario 1, which consists of both 1A and 1B. And what you see is that, so if you, I guess, a useful comparison is to compare 2070 results with scenario 1 implemented. So 9,500 acre feet of runoff volume, which is still higher than the baseline climate, no action or existing conditions scenario. So simply by moving from baseline climate with 6,500 acre feet of runoff volume, moving to a 2070 climate scenario, you increase from 6,500 to 13,000. Again, that's that 100% increase you saw for the 10-year event in a few slides ago. But then if you implement scenario 1, you decrease total runoff in the watershed by 21.5%, which is, that's fantastic. Great. But just know that that still represents a 44.7% increase over baseline climate, no action.
And I think what Andy's really getting to here is we need to be thinking innovatively and big picture, big ideas here. I think we need to move on a bit, Andy, if that's okay.
Okay.
We're getting really behind. Sorry.
Nope, no worries.
It's not your fault. Yeah, this is just a comparison again.
Very similar to before.
Right, showing
is no action, and on the right is with scenario 1 implemented. So you can see a significant reduction in the inundation extents in this area, Route 1 in Westwood.
So some of the individual flood mitigation solutions we would like folks to be thinking about and contributing to. We're going to have the breakout rooms starting very shortly here, but thinking about in your community, are there places you could remove a dam, change the impoundment to create storage with a reconfigured outlet? Could you reactivate a floodplain area by removing berms, barriers, fill, etc.? Could you put more water in a wetland by modifying the control or creating space, constructing large storage basins, flood control dams? Next slide. Increasing the height of a dam, allowing roadways to flood, relocating low-lying development and infrastructure, thinking about public space being able to temporary flood, and converting diversion. So keep all these in mind as we're going in the breakout rooms. So I think with that, let's get going with the breakout rooms.
Okay, and one question, I'm just trying to rebalance the breakout rooms here. Do we still want to do 20 minutes for the breakout rooms, or you want to make them shorter than that?
I think we gotta do 15, Ian.
Okay, let me just adjust that.
Sorry about that. We
That's
went
okay.
over.
All right, good luck, everybody. Hi, Holly, if you're there, feel free to jump into your room.
15 minutes went fast.
Welcome back, everyone.
Yes,
It was-
welcome back. Sorry, I was finishing up some notes there. As people are coming back, Andy, do you want to put the slides back up?
You bet.
So I just want to thank everybody. I do want to get you guys out on time. So we won't do a formal report out, but I know in my group, we had some great feedback from participants. We got some good information, and we will be following up with a survey afterwards. And there'll be more opportunity to provide additional information once you've had time to think about this. Next slide, Andy.
I think we can skip to the next step slides, Andy. Great.
There we go. Great. So again, thank you all for coming. You know, this project is continuing through the end of June. But as Ian said, we are considering what this project might look like in a phase 2 for the next fiscal year. So the MVP RFP is out. So we'll be in touch. If there's anything that you are specifically interested in, please reach out and let me know. We've got some other meetings coming up, which we'll show you in the next slide between now and the end of June. So please make sure that you've got those on your radar, and we'll be sending out calendar invitations for those as well. And finally, please make sure you are tracking your in-kind match for anything you do to think about this project, read emails about this project, attend meetings like this one, you know, consider the pre-meeting questions that we sent out, filling out the post-meeting surveys, that sort of thing. You've got the link for the spreadsheet that we've created. If that's too much and you'd like some help, please just send me an email with the staff and time that was spent, and I'm happy to fill that in for you. But just make sure that you're keeping track of all of that. And I think that's it. We'll open it up to final questions, anything about the project itself, the process, what you've heard about today. All right. Well, if you do think of any questions, please shoot any one of the project partners, project team, an email or give us a call. And thanks again for coming today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you at the next, at least we will see you at the next flood modeling meeting in a few months, and we'll have results and a lot to discuss then.
Thank you.
Great.
everybody.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Carrie, could I ask a quick question about the notes?
Yes.
So I guess, what is the